Welcome to Celluloid Citizens, a podcast about film. I'm Sean M. Thompson.
And I'm Brian O'Connell.
And on this, our third episode, we will be discussing the 2018 film Suspiria, directed by Luca Guadagnino.
Guadagnino, yeah.
Yep, and written by, I guess you could say it's a remake of a Dario Argento film from the 70s. Mm-hmm. I would say more of a reimagining, because it's not really like a shot-for-shot remake.
Definitely not.
And the script was by David Kajanich.
Yeah, I think that's it.
Chloe Grace Moretz, and yeah.
Starring Dakota Johnson, Tilda Swinton, and Mia Goth.
Yeah, so there's a lot of characters in this film.
And Lutz Ebersdorf, if we're counting him.
I forgot to mention this with Enemy. I forgot to mention the cinematographer of that film. So right at the beginning of this one, I'm going to mention that the cinematography, which is beautiful, by the way, was by Sayambu Mukdipram. And good. So I got that out of the way so we can actually start talking about the film now. I know you love this movie.
Yeah, full disclosure at the top of this episode. I never say that I have favorite films like ranked or anything, but since about last year, my go-to response is that if a gun is put to my head and I have to name my favorite film, this would be it for me. I'm totally enamored with it. I've seen it many times at this stage, and it's, quite a bit of praise for me for a 2.5 hour bleak, depressing movie.
Because it is a long movie.
Oh yes, very, very, and longer than most horror movies, certainly, which this is a horror movie of a somewhat unconventional sort, but
I would say so, yes.
But definitely a horror movie, and has a lot of bizarre historical context and information packed into it that, frankly, this movie and Annihilation, both of which I saw in theaters, while watching both of those movies, I was just kind of mystified that this had somehow made its way to general audiences and wasn't playing in an art house theater or something.
Well, to be fair with Annihilation, that was from what I've heard, that was sort of a rocky road.
Oh, yes.
They got it into theaters, but there was something about how they didn't do foreign.
Yeah,
It was something like instead of doing in foreign cinemas, they just decided to go to Netflix, which I don't even think went through. I think they ended up being on Prime or something.
I had read, and I may not be getting this exactly right, but the Paramount producers were extremely frustrated with the ending, which anyone who has seen the film knows that it's a very weird, mind-bending ending.
Annihilation, this is, yeah.
Yes, Annihilation. And they ultimately dumped the movie in February, which is a bad time to release movies in theaters.
Yeah, that's like the death block because it's right after the Oscars.
And they sold the international rights to Netflix, and from that point they may have been jiggled around a bit to various distributors, but they did not they weren't pleased with the product, so the rollout was very weird.
Yeah, which is almost a case for, I don't know what people's specific opinions are about streaming services doing original films, but you can't deny the fact that this was a very unique, esoteric film that might not have had the life it's had if it wasn't so heavily featured on a streaming service.
Yes, this is Suspiria we're talking about now?
Suspiria, yes, because it was put out by Amazon Studios.
There is some interview with Guadagnino, and he mentioned an anecdote of some intern at Amazon seeing the movie and being utterly mystified as to why Amazon had chosen this project of all projects to produce, because it's just... I think it's worth mentioning as well that the critical response to this film has been extremely polarized.
I would assume, yeah.
There are a lot of people, I would really say most people, regard it as bloated, overlong, confusing, dull. These are the adjectives I was seeing when the first reviews were coming in. and at the same time, there is a very devoted group of people who really enjoy the film and champion the film.
I'll admit the first time I saw this,
Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot to take in. So I think the first time I saw it, when I was done, I was just kind of like, I don't even know if I like that.
Yeah. Well,
Like, I appreciated it, but I wasn't even. So I went back this week and rewatched it, and I was pleasantly surprised to learn, like, oh, okay, I'm still enjoying this. So the first time it was just like, there was so much,
yeah.
what the hell is happening, that like it's almost
Well,
too much to take in.
and that's one of the things. So one of the reasons it's received a lot of flack is because it is almost nothing like the Dario Argento film on which it is based.
No, and I would like to mention briefly the Argento film, because I'm a fan of both films. And obviously I saw the Argento Suspiria first.
I have not, I mean, this is kind of shameful to admit, but I have not yet seen Argento's version of the story.
The Argento version is very different in that it's very colorful. Like, there's a lot of red and blue and pink gels. I would say the Argento version is much more. I mean, most of Argento's films, I think he even admitted at one point, he's like, I kind of go off of shot ideas. I don't really go off of plot.
Yeah, that's what I've read as well.
So even less so than this 2018 Suspiria, like, I could not really tell you. The plot of the 70s Suspiria is woman goes to dance school. Many other women are killed in horrible ways. There is probably a witch. The end. That's sort of it. It's more you're just looking at it just visually.
Yeah.
Like, it's very striking with the reds and the blues, and the architecture is really cool, and some of the kills are
crazy kills.
Really interesting. Like, he loves to like hang people, or like have someone get stabbed on a windowsill. He loves breaking glass for some reason.
Well, but so regardless of the differences between the two, I've read that, I mean, obviously Argento's film is very aggressive and in your face and, you know, hard to take in.
It is. It's very...
And you know, while it may do it in a different way, I think in its own way, the 2018 version is also very maximalist, if that makes sense, in that it isn't like, you know, the kind of crazy, insane kills in Argento's version, but it is still providing a pretty uncompromising vision to you that is hard to unpack and might put a lot of people off, which...
I mean, there is one scene in particular which we should go into.
Yes.
The first really heavy gore scene.
Yeah.
That is still really hard to watch for someone even like myself, who's in his 30s, who's been a horror fan since he was 12.
Yeah. When I saw this scene in theaters, the first time I just... after a certain point, just covered my eyes and ears because I was like,
just a lot to take in.
I was like on the edge of a panic attack, and I was still dealing with that, you know, like 20 minutes later, because it's so extreme. Which I guess we should describe what occurs in the scene.
Basically, the simplest way to put it is that Dakota Johnson's character, Susie, it's
well, so some, I guess, some general plot context.
Yeah,
because
that's important.
This occurs about like half an hour into the film, maybe 40 minutes,
something like that. Yeah.
Dakota Johnson is Susie Benian, who grew up on a Mennonite farm in I guess the Midwest, or Ohio,
I think.
Yeah, very repressive religious upbringing. And she travels to Berlin in the 1970s to be a part of this dance company. Obviously, Berlin at this time, it was divided by the wall, and there was a lot of terrorism going around, which the film also touches on with the Baader-Meinhof group. But she enters this company, like a very old and respected company. And I guess this isn't really a spoiler because they kind of flat out tell you in the first 5 minutes, but the company is run by a coven of witches.
Yeah, the Marcos dance company.
In this scene, the lead dancer, Olga, has just accused the teacher, Madame Blanc, who is played excellently by Tilda Swinton, of having something to do with the disappearance of a student, Patricia. And she calls them witches, exits the room, and then Dakota Johnson steps up to dance. And Olga is locked in another room in the basement.
Yes, there's this room that's entirely surrounded by mirrors,
which provides a particularly memorable effect for the moments to come. And Blanc does something to Susie's hands, so when Susie starts dancing, every one of her motions has like a kind of voodoo doll effect on the other woman in the mirrored room. And she's getting smashed against the glass, bones breaking, her jaw pops out at one. It's very graphic and extreme.
Yeah, it basically looks like she has almost every bone in her body broken.
Yeah, she's urinating.
Yeah, and she doesn't die either is the thing. She's still alive for all of it. You know, like another horror film might have this happen, but it would be a lot shorter and the person would just die.
Yeah. It's drawn out for like 2 full minutes. I think one of the things that made it so awful to watch is actually just the lack of blood. There is
no blood, no. I mean, the girl's performance, too. She really sells.
The interesting thing about it is they did it with no digital effects, and she did most of it with her own body because the actress is actually a contortionist. So it's a very impressive, very physical performance on her part.
It is. I can imagine this would be the point where a few people were like, no, I'm out.
Yeah. I mean, because up until that point, the film is really subdued. It's just kind of general ominous atmosphere with, I love the production design of this film. The building of the dance company is like very blocky and, brutalist.
I can say as someone who's seen the 70s Argento version, the difference is, this actually looks like a building that would be in Berlin, where I think it's supposed to be in Berlin in the 70s version, but it's clearly not. And they don't really go into the political backdrop either. It's just like, this is here, and like that's all you need to know. This one actually tries to get into the Berlin Wall and all of the political aspects of that time period, which I could see some people, even I'm at times not sure if so much needed to be kept.
Yeah, I that's one of the criticisms I can understand. But for me, I guess my interpretation of the film more thematically is that it is an allegory specifically about where Germany was at this moment in time. And they're not subtle about it necessarily, because they keep cutting to the Berlin Wall, and they have those radio reports about the Baader-Meinhof group, which was, for those who don't know, as I didn't going in, it was a far-left terrorist group composed mostly of young people who were responding to what they saw as a perceived lingering of Nazism in German society.
Okay, yeah, admittedly I didn't know that. I'm not a huge historian.
But so I think when you start to so this was a period in Germany after the Holocaust where because most of the German people had some involvement with the Nazis, quite a few ex-Nazis were back in, public positions and, working in society. And to the student group, this was like fascism was just kind of concealing itself behind, normal society, which is where, so in my interpretation, which is very subjective, the witch coven represents this lingering fascism in German society. Because though they pretend to be, just a dance company, they are actually preying on their students to give new life to Helen Marcus, who is, and when you see her, I guess we're getting into major spoilers at this point, but when you see her, she's this disgusting blob, really. There are like baby's arms attached to her, and she's just like covered in.
There's a lot going on there. Yeah, you get the sense that she's very old and has somehow combined other bodies into her original body.
Yeah, it's just one of those weird details that's included. They never exactly explain, but I guess
they don't, but in a weird way, she reminded me of a Cenobite from the Hellraiser movie. I think it was the goggles. She has these like black goggles.
When you see her, she's totally naked, except she's wearing like goggles or sunglasses, or it's kind of almost absurd in a way.
Oh yeah.
But she's like this dictatorial, authoritarian figure that throughout the film, because her body is decaying, she is trying to be placed in the body of a student, and Blanc chooses Susie to be her vessel.
I mean, if you want to go into allegory, she could be seen as Germany.
Yeah.
It's like this really weathered old society, and they're trying to keep it going by basically feeding young people into it.
Yeah, which is why I think the image of like students getting disemboweled, getting, as with Olga, like broken to pieces, is very resonant with the ideas of the Baader Meinhof group, who saw what they perceived as students and young people being sacrificed to the spirit of fascism, which is why I think the ultimate big twist of the ending, which is that Susie has not been who she says she is. I don't know if...
Well, we can wait and go into the exact twist.
I mean, yeah. But basically, I view this conclusion as a young person's attempt to purge society of this toxic influence, like historical influence. If that makes sense?
No, that makes sense. I could see that. I think we should probably try to landscape the film before we go into the ending, because without it, there's kind of, it seems out of nowhere. It is sort of out of nowhere anyway, but...
Well, yeah, some of the background of the Argento script and we've talked about Thomas de Quincey a little.
We have Thomas de Quincey's, the name is escaping me now, Suspiria de Profundis?
Yes.
Is sort of the source material in that I think Argento went through and picked the concept of the three mothers, Mother Suspirium, Mother Tenebrum, and Mother...
Lacrimarum.
So he took that, and I think he kind of made it his own. From what I gathered of the De Quincey piece, I don't want to go into it too much because it went a little over my head. But I don't think it's supposed to be a literal story. It's more like personifying the concepts of sorrow and grief and all this other stuff.
Yeah, darkness, tears, and sighs. I think he was an opium addict, so just... kind of spaced out visions of like metaphorical concepts and things like that.
But it does, when you make them literal, it is very creepy.
Yes, oh yes. It's
which is what Argento did for the original Suspiria.
They're throughout this film, and I actually, in the original Suspiria, do they talk about the three mothers specifically, or was that more of a retroactive thing that Argento made this trilogy?
I'd love to say I remember enough to know, but I recently saw Inferno, which is sort of the spiritual sequel to Suspiria, and they mentioned the three mothers in that, but I sort of get the sense it was retroactively retrofitted on. In the original, you just know about the Mother of Sorrows, I believe.
Size,
The mother of Size.
which is in that version Helena Marcos. But in this version, the twist, I mean, I'm getting back into the twist, but
It's fine, we can mention it.
the twist is that the whole time, it's Susie, Susie herself who has been Mother Superiorum, and like I guess the reincarnation or I don't know reappearance of her, and that while Helena Marcos has been claiming to be one of the three mothers, she's actually a total faker.
Yeah, she's a fraud. She's obviously a very powerful witch to have lived so long, but she's not one of the original three mothers.
And this is in the final ritual scene, when Marcus expects she's going to be transplanted into Susie's body. Susie is like, nope, I'm the third mother, and proceeds to literally explode the heads of everyone who voted for her in the room.
And it's a very interesting scene because for most of the, going back to I don't want to harp too much on the differences between the two Suspirias, but one of the big differences is you get this German block architecture, and it's this very kind of harsh lighting for most of the films. There's obviously no red and blue gels. It's just very like indoor lighting.
It's shades of gray.
Yeah, very earthy. And there's a lot of rain, which is in the original, but like in the original, it's offcut with, the blues and the reds. And this time it's just rain, It's
rain and then it's snow later on. It just gets colder and paler as the film continues.
So it actually seems like Germany. I remember there's a shot in the original Suspiria where someone's running around. I'm like, that looks like Rome, but I won't say anything.
Yeah, but in this final scene, they kind of do pay homage.
But yeah, they just go nuts. It's like what I like about it, especially watching this the second time, is it sort of mirrors what I've heard people describing supernatural events to be like reality just melts.
Yeah.
So the whole style of the film completely changes for this event, which I think when I first saw it, admittedly, I was like, really? Because it goes on a while too.
It was, for most of the film, excepting those few moments of extreme, death, like with Olga, it's really more of like a weird, tense drama almost. And then in the final moments, you just have, screaming naked women, guts on the floor, like a demon coming up from the bowels of the earth and exploding people's heads.
You have an old naked man.
Yeah, you have most memorably to me, Susie tearing open her chest and exposing like a mouth in her heart. It's a lot to deal with after.
It's a lot, but especially when you've seen it the second time, you sort of realize the effect they were going for, because once the scene is over, it goes right back to the sort of more or less realist style.
Yeah.
So it's almost like the shots and the colors and the acting is all mirroring the fact that this is this supernatural event, which is fraying reality.
Yeah, I've read some of the screenplay, and it's described in the description of the scene when Susie reveals herself to be Mother Superiorum. He says it's like akin to Jesus Christ walking into an Easter service. And that's like the kind of like earth-shattering tone I guess they were going for. And they enhance this with a red filter, which is the most overt tribute to Argento's cinematography I think we see in the film.
Well, there is actually a lot of the camera movements are actually mirroring, maybe not a lot, but some of them are mirroring the original Suspiria. Like there's this style of zoom they do, which is from the original film. They do that.
Just total, they have those split diopter shots. It's very kind of like a retro aesthetic. The director Luca Guadagnino said he was looking at the 1970s films of Rainer Werner Fassbinder, who did a lot of movies kind of charting the rise of capitalism in post-war Germany, which is kind of odd to me because I mean, this film got me looking into Fassbinder, and he's now one of my favorite directors. But I actually don't see a huge affinity stylistically, but certainly this, and I mean, it's shot on film. I think it's worth mentioning. It's not a digital movie. And there's this very visible grain to it, you know, like it's got this texture that you don't really see in digital films. So they're going for this definitely kind of, I don't want to say dated, but this aesthetic of something that's from the past.
No, and I appreciate when filmmakers do that, because it is a lot, by the way, a lot of extra work. Especially when you go to a studio, like, hey, guess what? We're going to shoot this on film. I'm sure they love that, because the price just goes whoop. Because you got to be paying for film instead of just digital.
I read an interview with the cinematographer, Sayambu Muktipram, I think is how you pronounce it.
Yeah.
But he says, and this kind of surprised me, I guess, just to hear it flatly stated from his cinematographer. But he was like, yeah, I only shoot on film. That's my rule. I don't shoot on anything else.
All right.
So, I mean, like, I guess good for him. He had previously collaborated with Guadagnino on Call Me By Your Name, which...
So that was film also?
That was also film, and shot the same year, interestingly enough. But...
Wow.
Yeah, to go from that to this is...
In the same year? I mean, just doing 2 films in the same year is enough.
Yeah, it's wild.
And having them both be good, by the way, too, because Roger Corman would do that a lot, but it's obviously the quality is varying.
Yeah, and just tonally, like, Call Me By Your Name, it's outdoors, it's positive, it's, you know, kind of...
Yeah, from what I haven't seen it yet, I want to, but I remember it looking very bright.
It's kind of a miracle. They shot it in a historic rainy season, and yet, I guess due to the efforts of the cinematographer, It
looks like it's summer or something.
It is. It's just a real... It's like a warm hug of a movie. Like, it's so inviting, and all of the food is nice, and the people are attractive, and everything's great.
Yeah, and this one is more like a nice warm loogie in the face.
Yeah, this movie is almost like deliberately alienating, I guess, in a lot of ways.
Yeah, so many aspects of it are just so odd and uncomfortable. I mean, right down to Tilda Swinton does a great job in this movie.
Yes.
I hesitate to say she carries it because Dakota Johnson does a great job too, but...
Yeah, I was very impressed.
She's definitely doing a real... Like, Tilda Swinton is like... firing on all cylinders. She's playing 3 different characters. Granted, for most of the movie, she's only doing 2. But she plays this old man in a way that... There's this show called Baskets where Louis Anderson is playing this mother character.
I've been meaning to see that.
It reminded me of that because it's like you don't even see the actor anymore. They just disappear. And it's really odd because it's not like... So many actors you can recognize they're doing a really great job of impersonating someone, but you always see the actor.
Yeah.
But in this case, it's like she's just gone. She's just, and there's prosthetics, so she looks like an old man, but just everything from the way she walks to how she talks to how she holds herself is just like, you forget it's Tilda Swinton.
Yeah, and I mean, I the second time I saw this, I saw it with friends, and none of them knew, which...
Yeah, if you didn't tell someone that's Tilda Swinton, they might recognize that it's somebody in makeup, but they wouldn't know who that was.
Yeah, they actually... So I guess it's worth mentioning that part of the film's marketing was that Tilda Swinton was not credited as the performer. It was, when Luca Guadagnino was asked about it, he said, it's this old German man, Lutz Ebersdorf, and he's in the credits as, casted as this old man.
Oh, that's funny.
Yeah, no, and they said that they never wanted to reveal it, but enough people guessed it.
I mean, it would be hard to keep that going.
Yeah. But, I mean, it's remarkable because in that ending scene, she's playing 3 characters and they're all in the same scene.
I honestly didn't even think about that part of it because there's just so much to take in. But yeah, She has to be playing an old naked man who's just like
Yeah,
terrified.
weeping.
She has to be playing
Marcus, a literal blob.
Marcus, who's a big blob woman, who has to go from this very pompous, like, I am basically a god, to, oh my god, I'm gonna die.
Yeah.
And then
And Blanc.
Madame Blanc, who basically gets her head cut off.
Yeah, it's it's just, I mean, hats off to Tilda Swinton.
You could spend like a whole hour talking about just what goes on in that last scene.
Yeah. Involving the last scene, but spreading across all of the film, I just want to mention the dancing in this movie, because it is kind of a dance movie in a lot of ways.
It is. That is one major thing. Suspiria, I think it's more about ballet.
Yeah.
I mean, the 70s Suspiria, but it doesn't really... You don't ever really get into the nitty-gritty of what it would be like to be a dancer and, like, having a performance to do what the specific performance is. And
Yeah,
you sort of get into it, but not... Like, this is like a dance movie.
I read that there's only one scene in the original where you kind of actually see characters dancing and practicing dance.
Yeah, and it's ballet.
Yeah. Whereas in this movie,
It's more interpretive dance, I'd say.
it's like it's definitely interpretive modern art, like weird dance, and there's an awful lot of it, like full-on extended sequences of characters dancing, and I think they're amazing.
They do a really good job.
The central, other than the memorable kill scene we discussed, there is the central scene is Volk, where the characters perform I interpret to be some sort of response to fascism or the Holocaust, because Volk is a Nazi concept, the concept of the people, the German people, and they're in these red ropes. It looks like
like red ropes, and they have interesting makeup. It almost looks like death metal makeup.
Yeah,
it's like you get like white along the eyes, and then there's heavy black eyeliner.
Yeah, I hadn't considered that, but that actually, it is.
Which is known as corpse paint.
Yeah, it is reminiscent of that. I know that in the costumes themselves, the designer sewed upside down pentagrams as like a little witchy detail. So
I didn't even notice that. Wow.
If you look at, I guess it would be their chest, like the netting between, I guess I can't talk about fashion, but
that's fine.
They're there if you look, like very visibly, like a pentagram, I guess.
The thing about the film is it's so layered that I can see how you can watch it over and over, because I took a lot from it this second time around.
Mm-hmm.
And I imagine, if I went back, I'd probably be looking for little pentagrams on their outfits.
The tape on the floor in that scene also incorporates a pentagram. There's just a lot of pentagrams in that scene.
Yeah, but that one's the more overt one, because you see this pentagram kind of style written in Patricia's notebook.
Oh, yes.
I think it's Patricia's notebook. That the old man who, by the way, this character plays a psychologist, I think.
Yeah, some sort of like, I think it's more of like a like Freud type.
Psychoanalyst. He plays Dr. Klemperer.
Whose wife Anka, played significantly by Jessica Harper, who was the original Susie Bannion in Dario Argento's version, disappeared during the war. We find out that she died in a concentration camp, Theresienstadt, and he's beset by grief, but he's also playing detective. There's a lot going on with this character.
Yeah, for an old man, he gets around.
Yeah, and I know this character specifically is one of the elements that a lot of people really dislike about this version,
because this is the old man is one of the newer additions, one of the things that stands out from the 2018 Suspiria.
Yeah, he is, I mean, he's largely separate from a lot of the dance storyline for, I guess, like most of the film.
Most of the film, yeah.
And it's just Tilda Swinton reckoning with the Holocaust, you know, like he visits his wife's cottage in East Berlin and he's like, oh, Anka, like he's talking to his dead wife. And I can imagine why, like, a fan of Argento's Suspiria, he's like, oh, this is the remake of Suspiria, let's go. And then they go in and it's just an old man, like, crying in his cottage. Like,
yeah, because the 70s Suspiria is very contained. Not that this 2018 Suspiria isn't also very contained, but it at least it goes out and shows you Berlin, whereas the 70s Suspiria is much more just about like being trapped in this one dance studio.
I mean, I've read an excellent piece, I wish I could remember the name, where it argues that there are references to German history in the original Suspiria. They're just very subtle.
There might be, yeah, I'll admit that.
Like the scene where, I haven't seen the movie, there's a scene where a guy gets killed by dogs. Is that accurate?
I think so.
There's some sort of kill scene that takes place in a plaza that Hitler used for his speeches.
Okay, so they did film it actually in Germany then, or parts of it.
Maybe parts of it. I mean, I don't know, but it was a good piece. But in this film, it's not even subtext. It's just
text.
Yeah, like really driving home like this is Germany in 1977, you know, over and over. And I can see why a lot of people would be frustrated with that.
Yeah, because the original is much more about almost this fairy tale. But I did want to get into this too. They're both like fairy tales, but just different kinds. The 70s Argento Suspiria is more like a it sounds weird to say this, but more of like a Disney version where it's like fantastical, and then this one is much more of like the original source fairy tale where it's like someone is feeding children to a witch or a bear mauls someone.
Yeah, I think actually I read that the original Suspiria's cinematography was inspired in part by Disney movies with these very vibrant colors and, like, you know, the girl going off into the forest and, you know, encountering witches. And I think there's a very intentional fairy tale quality to it. Whereas, as you said with this, it's doing everything it can to ground it in a harsh reality in a very difficult time period for the people of Germany. And, you know, the cinematography, while I do think it is very beautiful, is certainly not, you know, immediately eye-catching or visually popping, if that makes sense.
No, most of the film it's very cold.
That's the right word. It's like an unforgiving environment. And I think one of the other elements worth discussing is the conclusion, which I guess is the most explicit reckoning with German history in the entire movie, and one that a lot of people feel very ambiguous about, and by all indications, the screenwriter wanted people to have complicated feelings about. So, at the conclusion, Susie has overtaken the coven as the mother, and she visits Klemperer, who is shell-shocked, basically. There's actually a kind of comedic moment preceding it, where one of the surviving witches just kind of sends him out into the street after it's done.
Yeah, kind of like they've had a party, and, you know, he's the old man. She's like, okay, hope you get home safe now.
And he's just, like, disheveled and staggering, and she's just, like, kind of humming along, and it's, like, it's somewhat amusing. But Susie visits him and tells him the fate of his wife.
Which is it's very rough, you know, especially if you've been invested in finding out what the answer to this mystery is. It's basically, yeah, your wife died in a concentration camp.
She was, you know, froze to death during a census count. You know, it's and that isn't like fantastical horror, you know, it's like really brutal history. It's not, you know, it's the reality of what happened to many, many people in Germany. And then, after divulging this information, she decides to wipe his memory of of Anka, of the witches, of, she says, all of the women of your undoing. And the director, I should say the screenwriter, said he wanted this, he wanted the audience to be unsure about whether or not this is a benevolent act, that she is, taking away this suffering from him, or if this is her first step toward what he calls fascism, this idea that she now has the unlimited power to reign over, like, anybody.
Yes, because on the one hand, you could see it as a blessing where he'll probably go to his grave never knowing the really harsh reality of what happened to his wife, and he might be able to think that she's still out there somewhere and that she's, living out the rest of her days in happiness.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, he's never going to know what happened to his wife, which he clearly is very desperate to know, and then he's also not going to know anything about all of these women that have died in this coven.
Yeah. I know that the director, Luca Guadagnino, has taken the personal stance. He's not saying this is the objective reading of the film, but in his view, this is a villainous act to do, to take away the memory of an atrocity, much as Germany tried to suppress the memories of the Holocaust in the period immediately following the war, is a way of allowing it, like, kind of retroactively validating it, that, oh, you don't have to remember this terrible thing that we all did, and that to erase that memory is a sinister act, which is definitely a worthy interpretation of it, I think.
It is. One of the interesting things about the portrayal of the character of Susie is that everyone for the whole film is saying that she is evil. A lot of them, her mother says my greatest sin was putting her into the world, but she doesn't play her character like she's evil. She just plays her character like she's a 18-something girl.
Yeah. She's demure. She's not like, there are other girls, like, I guess Sarah, played by Mia Goth, is more outspoken. Patricia, obviously, much more outspoken. But Susie is just kind of this reserved, quiet person. She seems generally nice to Sarah and to the other girls.
She does, but then at the end, when she reveals, and I want to get into this too, but when she reveals that she is Mother Suspiriorum, everyone who was with Mother Marcos, she just explodes their head. Like, there's no question. She's just like, you're dead, you're dead, you're dead.
Yeah. And that, so to me, that could be, on the one hand, if you want to go with a more positive interpretation of her character, she's ridding society of the people who perpetrated this great evil in the way, like, kind of like a new generation fighting against the Nazi past.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, you could view it as somebody eliminating their political enemies.
Yeah, eliminating the competition. And then by the end, when you get into, is she doing a positive act or a negative act with the old man, it's important to note she is a supernatural being that is supposed to be a supreme witch.
Yeah.
And just because her performance is deceptive, because she's not like, she's not like twiddling her thumbs. She's not doing a lot of the very overt traditional witch things. And yet, it's more her actions than her words.
She seems very charitable and kind when she enters the room. And her statement, we need guilt and shame, but not yours, I think is a valid one. And she's arguing that the guilt should fall on the people in power. But the notion that she's obliterating her enemies and then
wiping the memory of the one man who might alert authorities.
Yeah, it's very, and I think it is worth remembering that while she is a young person, she is the reincarnation of an old idea, which I think metaphorically you could read, just another form of fascism returning, which I think it's worth mentioning for the historical context. While, many may agree with the ideas of the Baader-Meinhof group that that this Nazi influence in society had to be rid of. They were a murderous terrorist group.
Yeah, they were still blowing people up and kidnapping people.
Many innocent people, as well as former Nazis. So, you know, even if her goal is noble and her enemy is evil, as I think most people would agree Marcos is evil in this film.
She's more of the traditional evil witch.
Yeah, just because she's positioning herself against that doesn't mean her own actions are necessarily the right actions. It's a complicated ending, I think, in a lot of ways.
It is, and I could see how people might be annoyed with that who are into the Argento version, because the Argento version is much more overt. It's like, you know, this character's good, and these characters are witches, so they're obviously bad.
I think one of the most ambiguous characters in this film is Madame Blanc, who, in The Coven, is the only one who seems to voice opposition to Marcos. Because one of the early scenes where it becomes obvious that this is in fact a cult of witches, is they have a vote between who they want to lead the coven, and it's Marcos or Blanc. And she gets outvoted, and of course, those witches who voted for Marcos are ultimately killed by Susie at the end. But she's this figure who is doing terrible things to her students and exploiting them, but she has this weird tenderness. She genuinely cares about dance, which I don't get the sense that Marcos cares about dance.
No.
And with Susie, there's like a maternal or possibly even like slightly romantic connection she forms with her. It's very ambiguous.
Yeah.
But the day before the event where they're meant to make Susie the vessel for Marcos, you can tell she doesn't want to do it.
Yes, and that gets into the complicated nature of the character as well, because you wonder, well, A, is it because she's, you know, feels like this maternal figure towards Susie or is romantically into her? B, is it because she's just the best dance student she's ever had?
Yeah, I mean, and then, well, one of the other plot lines, there's so many plot lines running throughout the film, is Blanc is transplanting qualities from the other dancers onto Susie. You see that, like, when Susie can't do the jumps, she looks at this other girl who can do the jumps and, like, does some witchy eye motion, and then the other girl has a seizure, and Susie can suddenly accomplish the jumps. And it's like she's shaping Susie to be this ideal dancer. It's just very interesting to me. I mean, there's so much to consider on that front with, again, I don't mean to be going on about Nazis, but this is the lens I read the film through. The way, you know, Hitler in his deranged ideology was trying to create, you know, an ideal people at the brutal, terrifying cost of millions of lives and just people, could be read as a parallel to the way that, you know, every time there's a positive act for Susie, like when she auditions the first time, it's coming at the extremely violent expense of another student. It's interesting in that way.
It is interesting. One thing I wanted to ask you is, there's some debate whether the character of Susie was kind of born as the reincarnated version of Mother Suspiriorum, or whether she, as the film goes on, becomes Mother Suspiriorum. What do you think?
It's ambiguous, I think. Okay. Well, you see her drawing, like, Berlin in her notebooks as a child. So, and the way her mom talks about her, that she was my sin, you know, she was the thing that I smeared on the world. I do get the sense that she was born with this in her, but what I'm not sure about is when exactly in the film she realizes this, or if she's always known. Because it's kind of unclear. I read an interview with Dakota Johnson saying there's a moment in the film where she puts it together and understands herself as who she is, but I want the audience to figure out when that moment is, and I still haven't cracked it.
I haven't either. I do think it's heavily implied that she was kind of born as this Mother Suspiriorum, because otherwise, why would you have the insert of the flashback where she's drawing Berlin?
Yeah, I mean, that would...
Although it could be argued, because it does establish, even though she's in America, she's following the exploits of the Marcos Company. So you could see it another way, where she, even as a little girl, had been researching this dance company.
Yeah.
And knew it was in Berlin, and then was kind of just drawing Berlin because she wanted to be a dancer.
Yeah, it's interesting in that way. Because maybe it's just Mother Suspiriorum being deceptive or something. But to me, there's a huge difference between Susie through the most of the film, this, again, demure, relatively quiet, kind of unassertive individual, and the Susie we see in one of my favorite scenes, this dinner scene before the ritual is carried out, where Susie and Blanc are staring at each other from across the table, and you can just tell that Susie knows. She knows what's about to happen. And I wonder when that epiphany occurs to the character. Like, when does she understand her purpose and what she's here to do?
It is a good question. I do want to mention the music. It's done by Tom York of Radiohead, and I think I like it a lot. It is different than the original. I hate to keep comparing it, because I think it's kind of obnoxious when you can't separate two films, because it's like, obviously this isn't the same. But from what I remember of the original Suspiria, it's more of a synth-based score.
Yeah, it's like prog rock. I think the band is Goblin.
Goblin, yes. And this one is much more subdued, and I would say more of an alt rock, if you could call it that.
I own the soundtrack album, and it covers a few different territories. I mean, you have the notable musical moments are, of course, the songs, when Tom York is actually singing lyrics over the imagery. Obviously, Suspirium is the title credit song. Beautiful kind of piano, very reflective, and really the tone of his music in the film is more, I would say, melancholy and pensive than like out in your face scary or anything like that.
Yeah, but that's kind of Tom York in general.
Yeah. Although I find the instrumental piece for Volk, the dance, is like very, to me anyway, like dread-inducing and ominous, and very different from the piano melodies, in that it has like these like loud synths and like drums, and it's musically distinct from the other pieces in the film.
It is. It's, again, going into forgetting, like when you forget Tilda Swinton is the old man character. You kind of forget that Tom York is doing the score for the rest of the film. You're obviously you know when he's singing, because you're like, that's Tom York. But yeah, you almost forget, because it goes into more of a traditional style of score, which is kind of playing off of the scenes and the tone of them.
I know that the score for the dance scenes in particular were very, it was hard to choreograph, because the dance scenes had been shot without music. I mean, they'd been shot with a different track, so he had to score music to fit to both the movements of the dancers and just the editing. But I think, it's one of my favorite scenes in the film. That dance scene, the music is just so in sync with like these contorted movements they're doing, and it all feels very of a piece, especially with the editing, which I guess one of the qualities they teach you about film is you're not supposed to notice the editing.
Right, but I feel like that's also... there are some modern schools of thought that think, for instance, with a novel, you're not supposed to notice the sentences.
Yeah, well,
But I don't necessarily agree with that, because there are so many different artistic styles that to say there's one artistic style that works above all the others, I feel like is kind of conceited.
Oh, yeah. So, in this film, the editing is quite noticeable, both when, I guess the most obvious instance is again, that Olga's not death, but like crushing scene. You have this intercutting between Susie and Olga that's it's smooth, but it's like deliberate cuts and like all of that great transitional moments.
And then you get the reveal scene where the heads explode, where not only is there this, red gel and everyone's like naked and all this stuff is going on, this magical stuff, but the speed actually slows down. It speeds up and kind of slows down.
It's something with the frame rate in that it's like you can see the characters' shadows behind them, I guess, of the previous frames. I don't know exactly what the effect is, but it's like an almost like jerky stop motion feel.
I mean, needless to say, it's very different than the rest of the film, which is more traditional, which is a regular speed.
Yeah, although I do think there are just certain cuts across the movie that like maybe one shot will be left on too long, or the cut will occur at like a weird moment that just serves to add to the kind of destabilizing, disorienting vibe they're going. I know that the opening scene when Patricia runs into Klemperer's office, it's like just jumping across to these details of the room, like they cut to the book, they cut to the pictures on the wall, and it's very like jumpy editing. And I think, while some people, again, might find that irritating, I think it really serves the general atmosphere that they were going for.
It does. What do you think of the ending, and what do you think about the possibility of a sequel? Because I know that there is this shot at the very, very end after the credits where it shows Susie outside, and it looks like she's painting something on the wall with her hand or doing some kind of motion.
There's a lot of... I've read a bit about it. It's a very brief shot, and there's not a lot of information in it. She's out in Berlin in the snow, and she's looking at someone or something off camera, and she makes a motion. Some people thought that was the same memory erasing motion that she did to Klemperer, which I don't know what that would...
Okay.
I'm not sure exactly what it means, but it is a striking image to close on. I think... as for a sequel, I can't get enough of this movie, and I would love to see what a sequel would look like. I know specifically Guadagnino has expressed interest in doing a movie about Marcos herself. But yeah, he said something like, "Oh, I have a vision of her in the 12th century in like Scotland and like exploiting." It was kind of a weird pitch, but I would be willing to see where they go with it. But I don't know if this movie did well enough. He says, the thing about Guadagnino, I've also been following him on Call Me by Your Name, of course, which remains his biggest success, and he has said that he wants to do sequels to that as well, which that I don't see really.
Yeah, because isn't the whole point of that it's sort of like, oh, and it doesn't work out. If it just had a sequel where they're together, it's like, well, this doesn't
he
work.
said, like, wouldn't it be like interesting to see these actors like grow and change and, see how this relationship goes across time. And to me, the end of Call Me by Your Name feels pretty final. It doesn't need another chapter to it.
No, I will say, though, with this, there's so much source material, and, unfortunately, Argento did 3 films. I guess you could say it was a trilogy, and I've seen all of them, and I was cautiously optimistic about Mother of Tears, and it is honestly one of the worst movies I've ever seen.
I've heard that one is truly terrible.
And you feel bad, but it's like, he doesn't have anything all that dynamic about the gels anymore. He doesn't have colorful lights. It's just kind of like...
Yeah, when I was seeing... I know Inferno also has that visually...
Yeah, it's still got a little bit of reds and blues.
When I saw footage from Mother of Tears, which was made in the early 2000s?
Yeah, like 2005, 6.
It just looks like they shot what was there.
Yeah, no, it's and you could get into, well, it could be a budgetary thing, but I feel like...
Surely Dario Argento can harness some cred to at least make it. I'll reiterate, I haven't seen his films, but isn't a large part of the appeal of them just the visual style he employs? Because...
Yeah, it is, and you kind of... His later films have kind of completely lost that. Like, he did a version of Dracula, which I saw just out of morbid curiosity, which is also one of the worst films I've ever seen.
I've heard his take on Phantom of the Opera is terrible.
The thing is, there's this show, Masters of Horror, that was on Showtime.
Yeah, I've heard of that.
And I guess I've been thinking about it because Stuart Gordon recently passed, who did Reanimator, but he did a wonderful entry, Stuart Gordon, Dreams in the Witch House.
Oh, yeah.
Which is an adaptation of an H.P. Lovecraft story. But also, Argento has an entry in it, and I forget the name of it, but it was solid enough, you know? And then you also had John Carpenter doing something called Cigarette Burns.
Yeah, I've heard of that.
Which is, I think, I hope this doesn't get back to him. I feel like it's the last good John Carpenter piece.
Whew.
And I love him as a director, but there's something about this show where they gave them this sort of limited budget, but they were allowed to kind of do whatever they wanted.
Yeah.
Like, a lot of the episodes just play like shorter films. A lot of them are really interesting.
Yeah. I mean, also just generally, because we mentioned it, R.I.P. Stuart Gordon. But, you know, respect. But
yeah.
I mean, I don't want this to be a just Dario Argento tangent, especially since I haven't seen his films. But I mean, I don't get the sense that a lot of people watch his films for the plot per se.
There's almost never a plot. So
I mean,
yes,
you're watching it for like the bright colors and the maximalist like soundtrack and the crazy kills and all of that. And that's a valid...
Yeah, later on he did kind of move away from the gels, but even in stuff like Phenomena with Jennifer Connelly, it's got enough interesting visualizations and cinematography going on that it holds your attention. I mean, I'm pretty sure there's a monkey in there with a knife.
Well, I mean, and that's an interesting enough thing to watch the film for, I feel.
Right, but then you go into Mother of Tears and it's
a bad Suspiria sequel.
It feels soulless.
Yeah.
Like, it feels like he was just like paint by numbers. Like, all right, well, people want this, so I'll do it. It sort of reminded me of, since I'm already getting myself in trouble, I guess. It sort of reminded me of Clive Barker has a book called... now I'm going to forget the title of it, but it was basically the death of Pinhead.
Is it the Hellbound Heart?
No, because the Hellbound Heart is the...
Oh, that's the first one.
The first one. This is...
the Scarlet
Gospels, that's it.
Okay.
And I wanted to like it so much because I'm such a big Clive Barker fan. And him as an artist even, like, I love his paintings. And it was also, it just felt like paint by numbers. Like, I know he got sick.
Yeah.
Like, he was in a coma shortly, like, during... You know, he had a really botched dental procedure and went into a coma.
Yeah, that's terrible.
But it was, but similar. You know, it felt much like Mother of Tears, Scarlet Gospels. It felt very like by the numbers, like people want this, so I'm just doing this.
Yeah.
Which is something I don't like in a sequel. It's like, if you're going to do it because you want to do it.
And it's something I don't like in a remake either, which is why I mean, whatever you think of the film, you have to give it major credit for not trying to please people and like predicate it solely on the basis of, oh, this is a Dario Argento remake and people will go see a Dario Argento remake. Like, it is definitely trying to do its own thing that was not just, as you used to describe Mother of Tears, like a paint by the numbers take on Suspiria.
Exactly. And I think, that is the power of the film, is it tries to be its own film.
Even if that approach is flawed or it didn't work for you, I think it does. I mean, I tend to rant about the movie industry on this podcast, but
it's fine.
In a time where we're seeing so many just soulless reboots of classic properties and remake,
or even just making a film to establish a canon so you can later put that character into a different film.
Yeah, it's just it's refreshing to me to see a film that's like, F you, we're gonna make a 2.5 hour long film about German witches and like weird mother and issues, and like, it's refreshing to see that.
It is refreshing, and I do think that the more films I see, the more you realize that the with limited exceptions, the independent films are kind of what paved the way because there's less cooks in the kitchen, there's less budgetary restraints, and they're more willing to take chances because there is obviously less money involved.
Yeah.
I mean, even if you look at if you look at horror cinema, for instance, and some of the hugest horror films like Texas Chainsaw Massacre and like Last House on the Left and things that, kind of catapulted people like Wes Craven and John Carpenter to the forefront, they were doing those as independent films.
Yeah.
With a very limited budget. And that was sort of like, and then afterwards that just became, this is what horror movies are.
Yeah. I mean, I liked Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and I think part of its efficacy is that it feels like it had a budget of about zero.
Yeah, they needed a van, they needed gas for a van, and they needed a chainsaw with gas for a chainsaw. Then they needed to pay actors. That was about it.
Yeah.
And a house. They needed a house.
And some spooky bone decorations. But, I mean, it feels like, and this is part of, again, its efficacy. It makes it weirdly plausible that it's just people running around in, the wilderness.
I want to say Tobe Hooper said he shot it like a documentary.
That sounds right.
Which has a lot of the power of the film. It's not, getting into people who think that films you shouldn't notice the edits. You don't really notice the edits too much in Texas Chainsaw because mostly you're just like, oh my God, here's this crazy person wearing human skin.
Yeah, and I think it strips that trope down to the barest elements and what makes it so effective. And I think a low budget helps you do that. But then on the other end of the spectrum, you have this, which is, for a movie of its type, a substantially large budget. This is clearly a movie that had money put into it.
Yeah, and I think, going forward, I think that is very much because of the streaming services.
Yeah.
And I think as we go ahead, we're going to be seeing, or into the future, we're going to be seeing more and more films, like the films that are willing to take chances are going to come from the streaming services because they have more of they're not banking on one film. They're banking on repeat viewership, so they can take something that's going to wig people out and toss it up because they can afford it. Amazon Prime Amazon isn't destitute. Neither is Netflix or Hulu or any of those, but they can get these really talented people and go, hey, we'll give you creative freedom and we'll give you maybe less of a budget than you'd have with a major studio, but you can have creative freedom. And so you get more dynamic films.
Yeah, that's true. With Suspiria, sets like that and period detail like that, you couldn't get from A24 or something like that. You have to have money behind you in order to make that. And again, as you said, Amazon can afford it. If this movie doesn't do amazingly well, it isn't a huge loss for them. So that is one of the benefits of streaming, I think, is that a lot of the most interesting films I've seen, definitely last year, were Netflix films or, other streaming service films.
Hulu, for instance, did an adaptation of Nathan Ballingrud's The Visible Filth, which was changed to Wounds.
I haven't seen that yet, but I really want to.
Which was interesting. And then you've got something like Netflix. I think I've mentioned it before, but one of the first original films they did, Beasts of No Nation, which was Cary Fukunaga, which I'd love to cover at some point, was just this brilliant film that was just so brutal. And it looked like it would have been a movie that you would have seen in theaters. And honestly, if it hadn't been a Netflix film at that time, when it was when the awards were still poo-pooing streaming services, I feel like it would have been up for a ton of awards.
Yeah. Look at last year, they had Marriage Story, which is a great film, I thought. I really...
Yeah. I haven't seen it yet, but I've heard good things.
I recommend it. It's a little bit of a tough sit at times, but it's a very good film. And The Irishman, which...
Yeah, 3.5 hour film.
Yeah, Scorsese was talking about how when he was looking for funding for this film, every studio would say, okay, you can make it, but it can't be 3.5 hours. And Scorsese was like, no, this is the... for better or worse, this is the length that it needs to be. And Netflix said, we'll give you the money, we'll give you a 4-week theatrical release, and then it'll go up on streaming and you can do whatever you want, which, I mean, that is very appealing and good for filmmakers that have visions that wouldn't necessarily conform to a studio executive's vision.
Yeah, and to a certain extent, I don't want to be a jerk about this because it is a business.
Yes,
you know,
it is a business.
It is art, but it's also a business. So if you're trying to make back your money, you are sort of trying to hit as wide of an audience as possible, and you're sort of trying not to piss that many people off, because the less people you piss off, the more people will see the film, and the more target audiences and this and that.
Yeah.
But I feel like there's room for both, and I feel like everything doesn't have to try to be that movie that's number one at the box office that gets however many millions of tickets sold.
Yeah. I mean, Suspiria definitely doesn't seem like it was made to please a lot of people. And
no.
It didn't please a lot of people. I mean, but for me, it felt really good to see a movie that was that weird and unapologetic, like about concerns like, we're going to make a movie about 1970s German politics that most Americans know nothing about, and we're going to throw in some witches and extreme gore and nudity.
Right, because it's like, so if it was just the period piece about Berlin, you'd get the one type of audience.
Yeah.
And if it was the horror film, you get the other. And then you combine it, so you limit the audience even more.
Yeah, you alienate, like, the German history people were frustrated by all of the horror elements. And
yeah, because they didn't come
they're
for
coming
that.
for, like, you know, the legacy of the Holocaust in the Baader Meinhof era. And meanwhile, the horror fans are, like, looking for, like, you know, well, various things, but, like, certainly fans of Argento's film were probably not expecting this type of take. And it alienates both audiences, but for someone like me, it's like, oh my God, this is an amazing, weird film. And that's why it's earned a large deal of my respect.
No, I like it too. The fact that I sat through a 2.5-hour film twice and I have, like, no attention span should be evidence of the fact that it's a very good film and that at least I liked it a lot.
Yeah. I've seen it, like, I want to say 7 times at this stage.
And that's a huge time commitment. So obviously you adore this film.
I don't know. It's like it's almost like, this is a strange thing to say, but, you know, if I'm feeling down or I had a bad day, I can always go to Suspiria to brighten my mood, which, I mean, it's not the first pick for a comfort movie, but it works for me.
Well, there you go.
But one thing I wanted to touch upon, and I know we may be running low on time, but I wanted, just because we've been mentioning Dario Argento across this film, it is worth, across this podcast, I should say, it is worth mentioning that Dario Argento is not a fan of this film. He did not enjoy it, although he did credit Guadagnino with knowing exactly how to place a chair or something like that, which, fair. But he said that he much preferred films like Get Out and Hereditary, which are also part of the, I'm not using the term elevated horror, but the kind of interesting sideways.
I just call them good horror films.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think elevated. I mean, I could go on and on about
we
this
could have
as
a whole
lifelong horror fan, but I think elevated horror, I don't like the term because it
implies that there's a.
It's like insinuating that horror itself is bad. So to elevate it would make it like an actual watchable film, as opposed to just a very good horror film, which shows that there are, you know, some horror films that are bad, some that are medium, and some that are really
elevated
good.
Implies a category that it's above.
It implies it ascends from this ghetto
which
horror. Which unfortunately, I mean, there are people that do think that horror films are just, you know, Friday the 13th and Nightmare on Elm Street, which is fine.
It's a whole.
But that's not the whole picture.
Yeah.
That's like saying that, like, blockbusters are only superhero films. That's also not the whole picture.
Yeah.
Although it's most of the picture.
Well, but you have across the 2010s a kind of horror movie renaissance of a type. You know,
Well, you know what it is? It's giving voice to people that traditionally have been voiceless.
Yeah. But so Dario Argento was saying he did not like this film, and he much preferred films like Get Out and Hereditary. And while I do like this film very much, obviously, and also am a lover of Get Out and Hereditary, Suspiria, it's true, doesn't seem to sit so easily with that crop of horror movies in the 2010s. It's kind of, there's a difference to it. I was wondering, how does Suspiria sit with, Get Out, Hereditary, The Babadook, Midsummer, all of those? Like, where does it fall on that continuum?
That is an interesting question. It's almost like it's completely outside of it.
Yeah.
Because, yeah, you can, if you were mentioning, like, oh, a really good, like, for instance, say you had a casual film fan that wasn't the hugest horror fan. If I was going to tell them, oh, a recent movie that was really good, I would say Get Out or Hereditary, because it's a little easier to go into those just as a film fan and go, oh, this is really well made and it's scary.
Yeah.
And it's also not 2.5 hours.
And they have, they're deeply intelligent films.
They are, but this one is like...
Get Out and Hereditary have a fairly clear message or content to it. Like,
yeah, that's true though, but that would be part of the reason I would recommend it to just casual film fans.
I agree.
It's not gonna... You're not going to be spending hours like, what did that part mean? It's like racism is bad and demons are bad.
Yeah, obviously a common concern across the new horror film trend has been grief. So you see that with The Babadook and Hereditary and Midsummer. And you have race with Get Out. You have feminism and religion and The Witch. And you have, And these films...
You have whatever The Lighthouse was trying to prove.
Yeah, whatever The Lighthouse was. But you
know what? Actually, mentioning The Lighthouse, I do think if I was going to kind of put this 2018 Suspiria next to other films, I would say The Lighthouse is another good one because it's sort of archaic in some of its design.
Yeah.
And it's an interesting film that you can enjoy as a horror fan, but I don't know that all horror fans would enjoy it.
Yeah. I saw The Lighthouse once. I was hugely excited for it because I loved The Witch, obviously. And I guess I had the response to The Lighthouse, the initial response that a lot of people had to Suspiria, which was less like, oh, I didn't enjoy that or I did enjoy that, and more just, like...
Yeah, to be fair, that was my kind of take on this version of Suspiria when I first saw it was, okay.
Yeah.
It was honestly your love of the film that made me go back and want to revisit it. Because if I hadn't had someone like you, like, it's this really, like, amazing film. Like, I obviously appreciated it and enjoyed it, but it is definitely a head scratcher at times.
I mean, it's... And I have, like, my working interpretation of it through this lens of German history, but when I watch it, there are still things that just confuse me. Like, it seems like all of the choices had some sort of intentionality behind them, but it's not always clear what the intent is. Like...
Yeah, there are scenes, for instance, where there's a light in... Susie's room while she's dreaming.
Yeah.
You could say, well, that's like the spirit of the witches, but it's never really explained what that is. And even at the end of the film, you're kind of left like, well, what was the light then?
Yeah. In fact, like, a large part of Susie's dream sequences
don't make much sense. Yeah. Like, speaking of art films, like, they just become completely surrealist and you're like, what?
So, like, I'm trying to recall. So you have, like, a doll that opens its eyes. You have a woman rubbing intestines on her chest, glass shattering, more graphically, a woman performing what seems to be a sexual act with, like, a meat hook. And it's like,
yeah,
what is this? And it seemed like these images were obviously deliberately chosen, but, like, what is the meaning behind them? And one of the things I appreciate about Suspiria and The Lighthouse, although I think I need to rewatch The Lighthouse before I provide like a thumbs up or thumbs down verdict on it, is this commitment to not necessarily needing to explain certain things.
It's true. And
like, because, well, again, and this is not to denigrate these films, but Get Out and Hereditary are very clear and straightforward in their concerns. Like, anybody can watch Get Out and understand that this is about the African American experience in like a post-Obama America.
Exactly.
And Hereditary, you can easily take away, this is about grief, this is about inherited mental illness. I mean, the title is Hereditary. I mean, it's not
right.
It's not necessarily, it's not unsubtle, but it is direct in its concerns. Whereas this film, a lot of the time, it's unclear what is necessarily even happening in the plot, far less the point of what the meaning or the thematic content of it is. But I think there's an air of mystery to it, and the idea that maybe not everything in this film has like a clear purpose. It's just kind of some dark amalgamation of like, German history and like women's art and witchcraft, just like this kind of hazy interpretive fog, which could put some people off. But again, that's what I go for.
Well, but that is part of the reason I think that you love the film so much, is it holds up to repeat viewings, because as much as I love films like Get Out and Hereditary, they would obviously hold up to a rewatch, but I don't really have the same desire to rewatch them as I do with something like Suspiria or with The Lighthouse, where you're trying to figure out, is that supposed to mean something more?
Well, you rewatch Get Out and Hereditary to, I enjoy is maybe the wrong word, especially for Hereditary, but to appreciate the experience, the storytelling, the acting on display, the thematic qualities of the films, and, to be scared or entertained. Whereas movies like Suspiria and The Lighthouse, you go back to figure out, like, what the hell was that movie about? And I mean, there are so many interpretations of it that we haven't even discussed on this. Like, there's a whole feminist angle to this film. The religious upbringing, Susie. Like, there's a lot of other layers that I don't think you can cover in one podcast or absorb in one watch of the movie. So
no, and I mean, even this episode is like ballooning, and we're obviously sort of cutting off the analysis at the knees. So
yeah, I mean, we don't want the podcast to be as long as the film. But I mean, while it is a challenging thing to do, to sit down and rewatch a 2.5-hour movie about German witches that is at some points just dour and grim in ways that I guess are less appealing than the more heightened emotions of Hereditary or Get Out, which, while they're very brutal scenes in those films, there's a quality of humanity and emotion to it that you don't always see in Suspiria. These people don't always feel like normal people undergoing some sort of supernatural phenomena.
there are people that never seem normal in this film, the whole film.
Yeah, they're just kind of cryptic riddles of human beings that, I mean, Susie, while Dakota Johnson is excellent in this role, for most of the film is kind of an ambiguous blank slate, and you don't know exactly if she understands what's happening to her, what her ultimate goals are. And it's just archaic is a word you used earlier, and I think it's an accurate descriptor. It's archaic in a way that a lot of films don't try to be.
I would say it's outside of time, which on the one hand is why people are alienated by it. But on the other hand, some of the best films that have ever been made are sort of like that. For instance, even though you can watch, say, John Carpenter's The Thing and know that it's an 80s film, it is sort of also timeless, which is why it's had such a prolonged life.
Yeah.
And I feel like that will probably be the fate of this version of Suspiria, is that, you know, a decade later, people will still be watching this and talking about it.
This one is built to last. It kind of reminds me
It's so not of a time that it's like timeless, and it's so not for everyone that I feel like it's gonna get a very loyal cult following.
It reminds me of Enemy in some ways, actually, in that it's out to baffle you, but in that sense, it's kind of... It's built to last, and I feel like you could write a paper about this film and like deep dive analyzing it in a way you might not be able to do with films that are more straightforward in their concerns and storytelling. Like, you know, classic canon of confusing movies. I mentioned Persona last time. I haven't seen Mulholland Drive, but Christopher Burke on Facebook has compared this film to that in the sense that it's kind of a dreamlike riddle of a movie. I mean, it's the type of film that I do think will hold up past its initial, I guess, birth date or expiration date.
I think so too. But anyway, so yeah, this has been a long episode, which is, you know, proof of the fact that Suspiria 2018 has a lot going for it, and there's a lot to take from it. It's an onion that you can peel away and every time find a new layer of onion.
Yep. Even if you hate it, you can't deny that it's an onion.
Indeed.
And on that note,
I'm Sean M. Thompson.
I'm Brian Suspiria Levin O'Connell.
And this has been Celluloid Citizens. And... yeah, stay tuned. We're going to have a lot more stuff to cover.
Hopefully in shorter formats for you to listen to.
We will figure it out.
Good night.
Good night.